So now that we have an understanding of how a muscle actually contracts at the sarcomere level, we can start looking at um, the actual overall tension of the entire muscle, right? So what does it look like when we get essentially perfect contraction, peak tension with every single possible myosin head attaching to the thin filament and pulling it towards the center with as much force or space as possible? What does it look like if there's a little bit less overlap? How are we controlling and sustaining contractions, etc.? That's what we're jumping into in this portion of the chapter. So tension is essentially referring to the force generated by that muscle contraction. And so the amount of tension, the amount of force produced can vary. Right? And we're going to look at the characteristics that determine or affect that tension, being the resting length at time of stimulation, as well as the frequency of that stimulation. Both are going to have an effect on how much force, how much tension is produced. Where maximum tension, so the highest amount of force possible that that muscle could produce, would come from every single possible cross bridge being formed. So every single myosin head on your thick filaments attaching to the thin filaments, and thus they all are being involved in that contraction. And then if we repeat that stimulation very, very quickly, very, very frequently, that is going to build up into more and more tension, more and more force. So starting with the idea of resting length, there is a optimum ideal amount of overlap between your thick and thin filaments at rest to generate that maximum tension. Right? So it's not just about how many myosin heads are there and available, but those myosin heads need to have the ability to actually attach to the thin filaments. If we get overextension like this, where there's not enough overlap, even though we have multiple myosin heads available, only a couple of them are overlapping with the thin filament, and thus only those myosin heads are going to attach and generate force. Where the extreme on that end would be there's no overlap. So even though we're sending a signal for that muscle to contract, and even though calcium it has been released, active sites are available, myosin heads have energy, it doesn't matter because they are not close enough to each other to be able to form those cross bridges, and so no tension is produced. And so then if we look at the other side, where we have plenty of overlap, right? Every single myosin head is able to attach to the thin filament, but in this case, there's too much overlap. The thin filament is already close to that M line, so there's not enough room for it to move. Right? They can't really go much farther over the M line. There is going to be a point where that contraction cannot get shorter. And so even though you have every single head being involved, these myosin heads, and all trying to generate force, there's just not enough space for them to move. And so you get lower tension. The muscle might be short, the same shortness, or maybe even shorter than it is from this maximum tension zone, but there aren't enough things attached to each other to generate the same amount of force that we did with this ideal optimum overlap. So there is this optimum range of overlap here in the center, in normal range, where if we get too extreme, where we don't have any overlap, that's not going to allow us to build any tension, or it's going to produce some reduced tension with very little overlap. And if we have too much overlap, we get a similar idea of there's just nowhere to move those thin filaments, so we get less tension produced. And so that was looking at how the amount of overlap impacts tension. And the other characteristic that impacts the amount of tension produced is the frequency of stimulation, right? So that whole idea we talked about with the neuromuscular junction and that leading to that cross-bridge formation and actual contraction, that's just looking at like one instance of stimulation, which if that were to continue, if you stimulated muscle contraction and then allowed it to reach relaxation again, everything gets cleaned up, acetylcholinesterase, calcium goes back to the terminal cisterns, myosin heads go back to cocked position. That is full relaxation. And then another stimulus came again. If we just continued that process of stimulate for one contraction, allow for full relaxation, stimulate for contraction, allow for relaxation, that is referred to as TREP. which is going to end up producing slightly more tension from those first few contractions, from those first few signals being sent. Right? The muscle is now primed to react and is going to generate a bit more tension, but the maximum tension produced from those infrequent stimuli is relatively low. So if we can stimulate before the muscle reaches full contraction, that's going to start causing a summation where the tension is going to build on itself, right? It's sum, which means things being added together. So if we send another signal before the muscle has fully relaxed, we're going to start increasing that peak. Maximum tension is getting higher and higher. And the more we do that, the closer and closer we're getting to actual full maximum tension. So as those signals are getting faster, we get into this range called incomplete tetanus. And then complete tetanus would be where the stimulus is so fast that there is no time for relaxation. And so we're just generating more and more force. And that is how you would reach the full maximum tension for that muscle. So absolute maximum for how much force a muscle could produce would require this ideal optimal overlap where there's enough space for the thin filaments to be pulled through the center and every single myosin head can attach to that thin filament. So this is the ideal zone of overlap. And complete tetanus, meaning very frequent contraction stimulus telling us to contract, 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 which is going to it's going to build up those forces, that tension until we reach this maximum tension. Okay. And so in order to maintain that force, or what controls how long that tension is held, is going to come down to our motor unit recruitment. So your muscles can hold contractions for quite a while by rotating what motor units are being active. So lots of motor neurons control multiple muscle cells. And so one motor unit is referring to all the muscle cells that a single motor unit controls. And so one of the big ideas here for sustained contraction is that your muscles are going to rotate through those motor units. So if there's 3 motor units in a muscle, I guess I'm kind of skipping ahead a bit here. If we're looking at a muscle that is being stimulated by these 3 different motor units, only 2 motor units are going to be active at a time in order to sustain that contraction. So you did your one big pull, now you're trying to hold that thing there. That is, they're going to rotate through these units, allowing one to relax while the other 2 are doing the job. And then another one's going to relax while one of them comes back, and then another one is going to relax. So we're just rotating through, right? Like what's being shown here is motor unit 1 and 2 are active while motor unit 3 was resting. And then as motor unit 3 is being recruited, motor unit 1 is going to get to rest. And now motor unit 1 is being recruited back again, and motor unit 2 is going to rest. And that allows for those muscles to stay contracted, produce continuous tension without losing it and letting it go. Right? So that's for sustained contraction. You also have a resting tension. There are some motor units that are just constantly active. And this is going to differ very much based on how you have trained your muscles. So posture is a great example of varying resting tension. Right? The way your body holds itself, the way your muscles hold your skeleton at rest is due to whatever muscle cells, motor units are active, right? Holding the muscles in a sustained contraction, a light sustained contraction with light tension, keeping your skeleton in that position. Right? And the greater resting tension you have is what produces this idea of muscle tone, right? How firm a muscle is, even at relaxation. And so the more you train a muscle, not only does that make it generate more force when you are fully contracting it, but that's also going to generate a higher muscle tone, a higher resting tension. Your muscles become firmer because they have more motor units active at all times because they are primed and ready to react. Okay. Okay. And one of our last concepts here in this portion of the chapter, types of contractions. Right? We do have terms to describe what is happening when tension is being produced. So we tend to think about contraction as essentially what a successful contraction would be is the tension is produced and that moves whatever object is trying to be moved. In some cases, just the skeleton, right? There's not any other weight or thing you're holding, but moving your pencil, that is the object, the load that needs to be moved. Okay? That type of contraction where the tension was strong enough to actually cause a change in the muscle shape, to shorten that muscle shape and produce a successful movement, that is a concentric isotonic contraction. Isotonic contractions are any contraction that changes the length of the muscle. Concentric contractions are those that shorten it. So when the tension produced is greater than the amount of force that the load has, so you are stronger than the weight you are moving, you produced a concentric isotonic reaction. But sometimes, even though you are generating force trying to move something, that thing might have a stronger force moving in the opposite direction. And so even though you are generating tension trying to move that thing, it actually ends up pulling you the opposite direction and lengthens your muscle. That is an that is an eccentric isotonic contraction. Eccentric lengthens the muscle, concentric shortens the muscle. And both of those are considered isotonic contractions because the muscle length is changing. And so then our third type of contraction would be an isometric contraction, where essentially the amount of tension produced is equal to the amount of load, or the thing that you are trying to move, the load isn't moving, doesn't have force in the opposite direction. But either way, the net product is tension is produced, but the muscle does not change in length. Okay? So now we'll look at visual representations of each of these. Right? So an isotonic concentric contraction, the load or the force, the tension produced by the muscle is strong enough to move the load. So the muscle gets shorter when tension is produced. That is concentric. Right? As we see here, the muscle was able to lift this weight off of this floor. But in a scenario where the load, the weight, is more than the amount of force the muscle can produce, if we remove this floor, even though the muscle is producing tension, it's trying to lift this weight, it's trying to shorten, the weight is too heavy, it's stronger, so force in the opposite direction is going to cause the muscle to lengthen. This is a eccentric contraction, so an isotonic eccentric contraction. Tension is produced, but the muscle gets longer because the load is greater than the force. And then lastly, we have an isometric contraction, right, where there's no change in muscle length. So in this case, the same scenario as our eccentric contraction, but instead of removing the floor stays in place. So we have this weight that is too heavy for the muscle to move, but there is no room for that weight to generate force in the opposite direction. So tension is produced. You're trying to pull that weight off the floor, but there's no movement. Muscle stays at the same length. That is isometric contraction. Right. And so, final part of this portion of the chapter, as a reaction to these contractions, right, you are essentially training your body to either hopefully build up and be able to deal with more force or generate more tension, to move those weights that weren't moving before, or move around whatever thing. I'm saying weights, but I'm not necessarily just referring to a gym in the weight room, like the weight of anything that you need to manipulate and move around your environment, right? So as your muscles are exposed to this stress of needing to move things, that is going to stimulate hypertrophy, where as a reaction to that force generation, there are going to be small tears and rips formed throughout your muscle cells that are going to be fixed, repaired by recruiting more of those myosatellite cells. So fusing their cytoplasm, nuclei, mitochondria with the muscle cell that already existed. And that's going to give it more space and allow for the building of more myofibrils, more sarcomeres. So you get a larger muscle that can produce more tension. That is hypertrophy. Okay. So it gives us thicker, stronger muscles with more mitochondria, more glycolytic enzymes, more glycogen storage, more myoglobin, okay, all those things. And then the opposite, where you are not exposing your body to the same type of muscle stress that it might have been used to before, that is telling your muscles that you don't need them to be as large or contain as many resources as they currently do. And so those resources would be better used going somewhere else in the body, right? So your muscles will start to break down those myofibrils and those mitochondria, and release some of their sarcoplasm. It's going to cause those muscle cells to shrink a bit, right, to get smaller in diameter, with less mitochondria, less glycolytic enzymes, less stored glycogen and myoglobin, because they don't need to generate as much force as often. And that is referred to as atrophy. And so you can cycle through stages of atrophy and hypertrophy. You can build larger muscles, and then those muscles can, shrink and waste a little bit, depending on what your body needs, right? It's part of its homeostasis and regulation. However, atrophy is not describing muscles dying. A dead muscle cell cannot be replaced. Right? They are generated during early stages of development, and they can only be added to by the recruitment of muscle cells. You cannot just myosatellite cells, sorry, they can be added to by fusing more myosatellite cells. But if the full cell dies off, if you were to lose a complete muscle cell or multiple muscle cells with damage to that muscle, you cannot naturally just regenerate those cells. So some people that have experienced things like, I guess I'm from Florida, so I'm thinking like a shark bite, where a whole chunk of their muscle was taken away. Even though they fully healed and recovered from that, they still have like a divot in that muscle, such as their bicep, because those muscle cells were never replaced. It cannot replace itself. Okay? So unless you have some sort of transfer surgery where a whole new muscle cell is added to you from a doctor, your body cannot regenerate its own muscle cells. They can only build onto already existing muscle cells or break down those already existing muscle cells. All right. So that's where I'll leave you for this portion. And then we have one or two more short videos to finish up this chapter. So I will see you in the next one.